start to have a conversation about advisory groups and engaging advisory groups in health research, I just wanted to make sure that we're all grounded in the same understanding of this. And this means that engaging advisory groups in identifying research priorities. So this is really about engaging a group of people with lived and living experience in research decision-making around the process. And so this is having advisory groups identify research priorities, help shape and clarify the research questions, help select the methods and co-design, help co-create recruitment and information material for participants, help identify meaningful outcomes that should be included in the research, help conduct data collection. So we do sometimes have advisory group members on research teams actually co-facilitate or co-interview or are actively involved in data collection, engaging advisory groups around the interpretation of research findings, and then the co-development of knowledge translation approaches and methods. One of the first things that we always want to talk about when we're thinking about doing an advisory group and we're thinking about engaging people with lived and living experience, it's really to go out and talk to people. That's the number one step, really. It's about finding out what are the values and the expectations of people, families, and communities living with the health issue that we're looking at. Also, what's important to people with lived experience and as far as their friends, families, caregivers, and then what level do people expect to be engaged? So this is really important when we get to the decision-making process and who holds decision-making power. It's really important to get a good understanding of how people, what level they expect to be engaged, and also how people prefer to be engaged. Because sometimes we assume, of course, we say an advisory group, that's the way to go. But maybe when we talk to people with lived experience, especially perhaps around stigmatizing health issues, people might prefer to engage one-on-one. So it's really good to have conversations with community leaders, with people with lived experience, and really get a better sense of how people want to engage. And then it's good as researchers to have a good conversation around to what extent does the research team believe that patient engagement will improve the outcomes of the research process? What's the potential? So what health research questions can people actually influence and change? How is our advisory group? What questions can they actually change? And that really means looking at decisions and whether perhaps your advisory group might tell you to go in a different direction. How flexible and adaptable is the team? What is the likelihood the research team will fully consider patient partner input? It's really important to understand who ultimately holds the research decision-making power. And then what resources are available in order to support an advisory group, all of the patient partner members involved. People choose to do an advisory group for a number of different reasons, right? It may be that you want a diversity of perspectives about a health issue. It may be that when you talk to people with lived and living experience, they really talked about the level should be at a consult, collaborate, or even a patient partner driven research project. So an advisory group might be a great method to go. It could be resources and timelines. So looking at the timeline of your research project and thinking of who is available to help run things. You may realize that an advisory group might work better than doing one-on-one engagement or a workshop, those types of things. You may also want to set up a situation where people can feed off of each other's ideas, where you can bring different perspectives together and talk it through. It may be a preference too, as we were saying, of people with lived experience, because it may offer things like connection, a way to celebrate strengths and resiliency around a health issue. And it also may be that you are doing, especially if you're doing community-based participatory research action, the end goal is social change. So how do we actually implement? So involving community to be able to implement change further on. Partners may come to an advisory group for a number of reasons and a number of different motivations. People may come because they want to help others, help their community, or help others who are going through the health issue that they're going through. They want to give back. They want to help work towards improving the quality of care for others and themselves. They may want to just the idea, the opportunity to connect with others and to have a say in health research as well. And so really understanding why your members might be coming to the team as well is important, understanding values. It's really important as you're thinking about your advisory group to be very clear about what the purpose is. So what patient engagement in the research project is meant to achieve. So and also how patient partners will contribute to decision making. So being very clear from the very get-go, so then you can be transparent with the advisory group, but also understand how to set up your advisory group meetings later on down the road. There are different resources that are often required when you're forming an advisory group. Having a point person, so having someone that people with the members can actually connect with if they have questions or concerns. This can be a dedicated person, this can be the principal investigator themselves, but just being very clear about who the person is that can be contacted. You may want to have somebody with some facilitation experience. Maybe on your team, you've got somebody with that experience, or maybe your advisory group decides that they want to have members as co-facilitators instead. So really thinking through that aspect. One thing that's often overlooked as you're starting to establish an advisory group is that it requires a fair amount of administrative support as well. So things like booking space, food, making sure that everyone honorariums are paid, making sure that online space is booked, all of those different things. So really acknowledging that that is an aspect of establishing an advisory group and who's going to do it and how we're going to do it. And then audio, visual, and text support. So whether we're engaging online, whether we're doing hybrid engagement, having someone, and even just when you're engaging in person, if you have any tech support, you may need some supports, right? Especially because if you perhaps are the one facilitating, you need someone who can help people with lived experience if they need some support in the tech area. So thinking about who's going to be that person. And then financial, just thinking about compensation for patient partners. We're huge advocates for that, for their time, their insight, their contributions to the project as they sit on an advisory group. And when you're thinking about compensation, it's not just the time that people are at a meeting with the advisory group, but it's also the time of preparation and follow-up and the in-between work that goes on. Food and beverages, if you're in person, transportation and travel, so like bus passes, parking passes, mileage, childcare and respite, accommodations if people come in for an advisory group from out of town, paying for technology. So if some people don't have access to the technology in order to engage online, making sure you have some money for that, accessible space, even things like materials, printing, all of that stuff, mailing out as well. And a little plug for CHI does have a little budget builder that you can use if you're starting to think about how, what your budget could be for an advisory group. When you're thinking about who to recruit for your advisory group, I always say the first step is to think about what health inequities exist in the area of research that you're looking at. So who is affected differently by the health condition? Who has different access to healthcare services associated with this health issue? And so really thinking about not only geographical barriers to access to care, so rural and remote, but also thinking about systemic barriers, whether it's racism, colonialism, sexism, transphobia, homophobia, ableism, sizeism, saneism, all of those different things. Think through those different aspects in order to think about who you want to have on your advisory group. That can reflect these different perspectives and make sure that what you're doing addresses issues of health inequity. Also think about where along the health journey people are. So if you're starting to form an advisory group and you have members who are newly diagnosed with a health issue versus people who have lived with a health issue for many years, you could have people who are recovered and then some people who are just diagnosed. And so thinking through where along the journey your members are is really important, because that also contributes to the dynamic that evolves in the group later on, right? And some of the thoughts that you might have to think about, whether it's using some breakout groups and things where you may want separate perspectives and how you're going to navigate that. And then finally, just how am I going to ensure that a diversity of perspectives on our advisory group is done? And that's, thinking through different participatory approaches that are going to meet people where they're at. And we'll go through that as time goes on. You'll do a call out if you want to do a call out, or you may go and talk to community groups. For the call out, you can kind of lay out the idea of what you want to do in lay language, kind of how the opportunity to engage and some of the roles and responsibilities, the time commitment. Really make sure in your call out that you talk about honorarium. Will people be paid as partners? And then the contact information. And again, CHI has a little one pager on our website that can help you develop a call out if you're looking for patient partners to involve in an advisory group. And then ways to recruit, of course, are a lot of different ones, like health researchers who have engaged in the past in this area of health may be able to help you out, clinicians as well, healthcare consumer organizations, but also thinking outside of the box and developing relationships with community organizations as well, attending events, going and volunteering your time to start making those connections. Also social media, depending on who you want to reach, newspapers, radio stations. Sometimes in rural and remote locations, you may find a popular community radio show that you can come on and talk about the opportunity. Talking to other people with lived and living experience if they have some suggestions, information sessions, and attending events. There's tons of ways that you might want to recruit. Sometimes with advisory councils, people do applications, like more formal, either written and also oral. So with the contact information, equity, diversity, and inclusion questions, why people are interested and what you feel you bring to the table, skills and experiences, really understanding what people's availability is and preferences on how to engage and where to engage. So really asking if they have suggestions of where would be the best place to engage as well is good. And then sometimes you may do an interview as you're meeting your different members. It can be less formal. It can be going for coffee with people and just talking a little bit about the project, asking people if they're willing to share a little bit about themselves and their experiences, but only to the level that they're comfortable, why they're interested in becoming an advisory group member, if they've had any past experiences, what was good about those experiences and what wasn't good, and like how can you make sure that that doesn't happen. Asking people just about their special interests and life experiences and skills and what kind of commitment they're able to make to the advisory group. Are there any days or times that really don't work for you? Also, just any questions for the group as well as far as that, and really thinking about those aspects. And then if it's online engagement, there's kind of another level of conversation about how comfortable do you feel working online, making sure that people have access to a device as well as internet connection, whether they have audio and video on that device, whether they feel comfortable with Zoom or WebEx, whether there are any health or ability restrictions that they need to be aware of that we can address. Has your availability changed? So perhaps you thought it was in person, it's online. Has your availability changed? Do you have a space in your home where you feel comfortable enough to freely share your thoughts and ideas? If not, maybe we can help book a space within a community center or somewhere that you can engage in a safe place. Do you have any suggestions for ground rules with meeting online? Some people bring great suggestions. And then questions for the team as well, and any concerns. Sometimes you'll do an orientation session, or sometimes you'll get right into the first advisory group. For orientation, you may talk about, just do some introductions, some icebreakers, an overview of the project and some of the opportunities to engage. You may discuss things like confidentiality, compensation, and how we're going to communicate with one another and make sure we're reaching everyone. For the compensation conversation, I would say you can give an overview of honorariums, but I would have individual conversations with each member just to address any of their concerns one-on-one. Sometimes people say, well, what training should my advisory group members take? And so I'm always of the perspective that both researchers and patient partners and anyone involved on the research project should take training together. So you might want to do patient engagement 101. You might want to do a session all together on trauma-informed engagement and how can we work together. You may do some training on anti-oppressive and anti-racism approaches or cultural safety. Sometimes there's some training on conflict resolution, so you can get out there already to tackle that. CIHR's 4, they have a foundations in patient-oriented research curriculum, and that can actually be taken by a team, both researchers and patient partners. So maybe your advisory group and the research team want to take it together. You can look at your SPORE support units. They all have different interesting training offered. And then if you're talking about engagement of specific populations, so First Nations, you'll want to think about OCAP principles, thinking about CIHR TCPS2 Chapter 9. So thinking about that. Also in Manitoba and BC, they have some Indigenous cultural safety training that I know research teams and advisory groups have taken together as well. And so those are some suggestions. Then when we start talking about the formation of the advisory group, and as you start developing as a relationship and meetings and all of those things, we like to refer back to the Valuing All Voices framework that was developed here in Manitoba, and really looking at what people with lived and living experience think are really important to the development of an advisory group and relationships. So thinking about understanding and acceptance, trust, relationship building, self-awareness, education and community, education and communication. And when we talk about self-awareness, one thing that I always think is really important for both an advisory group and research teams in general and patient partners is to do something called critical reflexive practice. And that's just building self-awareness about how your social location, the many social locations in which you inhabit, may influence the way you view a health research question or the way you may interact with one another. And so there's this readiness to engage workbook that we have at CHI that has some questions for patient partners, so advisory group team members, researchers, to do some individual thought around that and some questions, and it's actually a fillable PDF, so you can work through it together. And then as a group, when you come together, you can also, there's some questions that you can work through together as well. And so that's an important aspect, I think, as you develop your advisory group. Now we're going to start talking about mapping out your engagement strategy when it comes to your advisory group. So what decisions, this is the biggest thing out front, what decisions can advisory group members inform? looking at your project timeline. When do these decisions have to be made? And then when you look at that timeline, you've got to be able to have enough time for your advisory group to be able to make those decisions and meetings and so on. So making that, building that into your strategy. What possible participatory approaches might we be able to use when we're engaging as an advisory group? So sometimes when we do advisory groups, we start running them like research team meetings. So we just come with a bunch of questions and we come and say, okay, what do you guys think? But in a way to kind of meet people where they're at and allow people to fully contribute, we want to think about different participatory approaches we can use when we're coming to the group to make decisions. And then also talking about thinking through how you're going to handle the in-between times. So sometimes when you're doing data collection, there's a huge amount of time that passes between advisory group meetings. And so you've got to think about how we're going to touch base with people with lived experience, whether we want an in-between meeting just to connect one another, thinking through that aspect. Some of the foundations for advisory groups: icebreakers. As much as I know a lot of people are like, icebreakers, but icebreakers are really important. It's a way to set the stage. So starting the meeting with just going around, reintroducing ourselves, reconnecting, and having an icebreaker is really important. Think about the icebreaker though that you choose, because sometimes icebreakers have been chosen in a way that don't necessarily work with groups. So for example, if you're engaging people with lived and living experience, who may be living in lower socioeconomic status, we're not going to talk about like, what was your favorite vacation destination and things like that. So thinking through what icebreaker is going to work for everyone is really important. Conversations around safe and brave spaces. We're going to talk a little bit about this, but I think this is your first meeting has to have this conversation. It's really important to build guiding principles. You can also, other relationship building aspects, co-creating a vision statement or a justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion statement. Another aspect I think is super important is always having a list of counseling supports and resources on hand. Sometimes for advisory groups, I've seen that the resource list goes with the agenda every time before you meet so that people have it on hand. Should they just need some extra support after an advisory group meeting? And then always having a wrap up, not leaving it just like, okay, we made a bunch of decisions, bye. Wrap-ups are good. So going back around and having a conversation about final thoughts. And then one that I like, I'll mention later on, is just maybe talking about one good thing you're going to do for yourself that night. And so having a nice final wrap-up is always a good idea. And so it's kind of like a sandwich. When you think about your advisory group meetings, is always have an icebreaker and always have a wrap-up, just to kind of set the stage. One thing that we've learned over time, that's kind of that over time we've learned over and over again, is it's really good to do one research decision per meeting. Remember, this isn't a research team meeting where we're going to address like five different processes all at once and make all those decisions. A lot of times it takes enough time to have a meeting, use a participatory approach to get people's feedback on a decision. So it's preferable to have a couple of meetings where you address one decision at a time versus trying to cram it into one meeting. Think about the participatory approaches for each decision that you make that will allow people to fully contribute their insight and their knowledge and their expertise, and then meeting people where they're at. And we'll have some examples of that. So sample first meeting. You might want to start with some introductions and acknowledgements. Again, the icebreaker, then a conversation around safe spaces and guiding principles. Then the purpose of engagement, so why we're doing this, a little bit of an overview of what's been done so far, Here's where all the opportunities to engage, being really transparent about that, benefits and preferences for engagement, and then next steps and wrap up. So this is kind of like a sample. So our welcome and acknowledgements, having the icebreaker activity. This is an example of one. So you introduce yourself, and then, so we chose a photo. And this is, we ask each member to introduce themselves and then take a look at the photo and reflect upon what it means to you or what stands out to you. And the whole reason for this type of icebreaker is that by the time we get all the way around and talk to every member, we'll see that we're all looking at the same thing, but we're seeing things differently. And so that just kind of shows that our perspectives are different. And that's what makes the advisory group so great, is that we're bringing all these different perspectives together, looking at the same thing. The safe spaces conversation, I think, is super important for your group. This involves going through each type of safety. So what does physical safety mean to you, look like to you, and feel like to you? And the reason we're asking this as a group is because it means different things. It feels and looks differently for each member of your advisory group. So there's no one kind of overarching. So having that conversation and writing it down, emotional and psychological safety as well. What does it mean to you, look like to you, and feel like to you? Oops. And then we also have cultural safety and spiritual safety. And people bring up incredible, every advisory group has come up with completely different ideas and principles. So what we do is, after we have each of those conversations, we build something called guiding principles. And it's something that we can refer back to on a regular basis. It's something that gives the group a common language for people. So if you are feeling like things are not going well, or that there's some power imbalances, you can say, can we review the guiding principles? And it's like a common where we have to think about, and then we can go back and have that conversation. And you can add and elaborate over time. And so our collaborative partnership developed an amazing one over time. And so and we refer back to it all the time. It's important, though, to have a conversation also about the difference between safety and comfort, because they're very different things, right? And the primary, the big one is that if someone in the group says something that's harmful to another, so it's racist, sexist, homophobic, ableist, transphobic, xenophobic, anything like that, you will be challenged on it. So that may make you feel uncomfortable, but that is not unsafe. It's really unsafe for the other person who may be harmed by what you're saying. So really having that conversation with the advisory group and setting that expectation that you will be challenged. And then if you're facilitating these things, you have to model that by stopping and addressing things as it comes along, which can be difficult and it can leave other members uncomfortable, but it's a way to build that relationship, right? And to be honest and transparent and build that trust amongst each other. When you're talking about purpose of engagement with your group in the first meeting, you can talk about, why people were brought together, some of the roles and expectations, not only of members, but also of the research staff. What can you expect from us? Some anticipated outcomes that you're hoping for with the engagement, and then being transparent about the timelines as well, that certain things take a little bit longer, and how you're going to keep that communication going. And then talking a little bit about what's been done and about the study and how people will be engaged. You can talk about opportunities to engage with the group as well, and also see whether the group comes up with ideas too about how they would want to be engaged. So what decisions are available for people to engage? How will the advisory group members' contributions be used, and who will make the final decisions? the commitment that's going to be required. You can, again, as we said, if you do an orientation, you'll probably address this, but if you go straight into the first meeting, you can talk about compensation and reimbursement. But again, one-on-one conversations for the detailed aspect of how people prefer to be compensated and those aspects. You can talk about confidentiality as well. So conversations around things like, oftentimes we say, things that we learn. So things that we learn about research, we can share, but any of the stories and things that people share amongst the group will stay here within the group. But also talking about the limitations of confidentiality as well. And then talk about opportunities for ongoing engagement. Talking about some of the benefits that the advisory group team members would like to see out of this. So some people may say, I really want to learn how to present, or I'd really like to learn how to do, any number of different things. Like I would like, benefits like maybe a reference letter from or maybe it's acknowledgement in this way. This is how I would like to be appreciated. These are some of the benefits I'd like to see. And then talking about preferences with the group around scheduling, the frequency, the location, accommodations, how we address things, dietary preferences and restrictions, how we prefer to communicate. So sometimes advisory teams love having kind of an asynchronous ability to engage online and have a platform in between meetings to engage, and then other people prefer to be texted information. Some people like it by email, some people like a phone call. So having that conversation. With some of the groups we've engaged over time, we have a whole spreadsheet of every way that people prefer to engage. So we make sure that we're doing that. And yes, this is the wrap up that I typically use for all meetings, but it's one, just if you've had a heavy advisory group meeting, it's one way of having people focus forward about something that they're going to do for themselves, something good that they're going to do for themselves after the meeting. And so focusing on a little bit of self-care, acknowledging that sometimes meetings and their topics can be a little bit heavy. Other options for relationship building. In the past, we've done a vision statement, and what we've done is adapt the Tree of Hope model. So where the earth represents all the valuable experiential knowledge that the advisory group brings. The roots are what we think are the root causes of the health issue that we're looking at. The trunk is dreaming, the dream big. So what kind of supports or what kind of change we want to see. And then the branches look at both the roots and the tree. And we slowly co-construct a vision statement for a group. Also, there's sometimes groups want to build a justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion statement. So under the justice, we think about what barriers need to be dismantled, not only in the health issue that we're looking at, but also as a group, what barriers might be present that we need to address when it comes to the engagement of the advisory group themselves. Equity around allocating resources so everyone has access to the same opportunities. This goes for the group as well, the advisory group. So what resources may we want to allocate? And then diversity, so differences, so the acknowledgement that differences between us are based on systems of power and oppression. And then inclusion, fostering sense of belonging by valuing and amplifying voices traditionally less heard. So having those conversations to develop a statement can be another method of relationship building. So when we start to talk about participatory approaches, so we've broken down every phase and stage and we've thought about the decision. So what if you want to engage your advisory group in priority setting? What should we be looking at for our research project? So at the very beginning, you can use a number of different participatory approaches and also be open to the group telling you what approach they want to use to make decisions. But here are some examples. So nominal group technique. We've done ones where we've had everyone journey map, and then from there pick out some of the overlapping priority areas in the advisory group. Observation, so have advisory group members observe an existing service and then come back and report on what they think might be some priority areas or gaps that we should be looking at. There's things like the Delphi process, or there's democracy where you can on your get a bunch of priorities and then vote. There can be using, drawing, storytelling, writing, or taking photographs of things that you think are a priority, and then bringing it to the advisory group and having a conversation with one another about it. There's more rigorous ones like James Linda Lyons that will take way more than one meeting. So you may want to think about that one. For the research question, there's a number of different participatory approaches you can use. You can do smaller discussion groups where you break up your advisory group and have smaller, intimate conversations that are guided and focused. You can have members of the advisory group interview each other and talk about what the research question should be. You can use something called participatory decision making, which is a really it's a very defined process for an advisory group to go through decision making. For outcomes, you can think about writing or drawing or storytelling, taking a photo of outcomes that are important to you and then sharing back with the advisory group. And this can enable, because outcomes is a really tough one sometimes, and we've struggled with advisory groups before talking about what is an outcome. And so these are ways to just meet people where they're at and have that conversation. The tree of life exercise can also be used when you're coming up with outcomes to include in your research project, because you can kind of talk about the branches as the outcomes and then build from there. Appreciative inquiry, that's a technique that you can talk about, dreaming big and what would be the outcomes that we want to see if we were that we want to include in the project. As far as design, so picking different methods, there is like a method where you can have your advisory group act as a jury and have people come in and present as like presenting to the jury different types of methods. We can do study circles, so breaking off the group again into little circles and looking, maybe presenting different methods or ideas about what method we should use for the research project. And participatory design, again, is another one. When it comes to reviewing, having your advisory group review different different participant materials like recruitment materials and posters and callouts for participants. You can use the whiteboard. You can do role playing to work out the protocol and whether it works for potential participants. You can have conversations in open space as well. Data collection, of course, advisory groups could be co-facilitators, co-interviewers, or do patient observation. With interpretation of findings, we did an interesting one that was quantitative, and we talked about what story do the findings tell us, and then do they align to the story of each of the members of the advisory group? And then what story is not being told. And in that, you really start looking at the context in which the research findings occur. And then you look at the limitations of the research, and then what stories are not being captured by the findings. For knowledge translation, there's tons of different kind of co-design methods that you might want to use. Focused conversations, discussion groups, participatory design, and then evaluation. Evaluation, I actually always put at the top, but thinking about appreciative inquiry, digital storytelling, interviewing one another, and so on. And there's a methods book that you might be interested in, and that's at CHI's website too. So here's a potential outline of, say, maybe we have 2 years and we have We have 9 meetings that we're going to do with our advisory group. So maybe I would say meetings 1 and 2 are just pure relationship building. So guiding principles, vision statement, Jedi statement, having those conversations with the group. Meeting 3, if you want to do some priority setting and designing of the research question. I'm violating my rule about one decision, but I tried to confine, or you might have too many meetings. But say you want to do a little journey mapping. So each of your advisory group members has an opportunity to map their journey and then identify where there might be priority areas that they want to address, and then co-creating the question. For evaluation, I like the idea of having evaluation at the beginning so the group can kind of talk about what success, how they define success in their for the advisory group themselves. So you could do an appreciative inquiry conversation. For the design, you might want to do some study circles, or even you might want to have an online board in between meetings that people can refer to. In interpretation, I mentioned that storytelling, so you could have a meeting where we just do some storytelling. And knowledge translation, I did put meeting 7 and 8 because knowledge translation typically takes more than one advisory group meeting, because you want to take what they've said and then come back with perhaps a design or a protocol for them to review again. So that sometimes if you don't have that amount of time for your advisory group, you may ask if some members would be interested outside of advisory group meetings, helping to inform the development of the KT tool or method. And then having a celebration of some sort and a wrap up, and what are the next steps. So what's going to happen as it comes to an end. So the sandwiching with icebreakers and the wrap up is one of the things, making sure that you communicate back in between those meetings how the advisory group informed the decision. So making sure that there's always a feedback loop. As I said, knowledge translation sometimes takes more than one meeting. Touching back on the guiding principles on a regular basis, considering mid-review evaluation, so talking to each member about how they're feeling about the engagement, what could be done differently. Regular touch base, so debriefing with members and regularly connecting with them. And then always making sure there's a lot of choice and relationship building throughout the entire process. So once you do the first 2 meetings, don't just suddenly drop it and make it all about the decisions, but really think about how relationship building, whether it's having maybe a holiday gathering or having like gatherings in between meetings to connect with one another, go for coffee with people, send birthday cards, get to know each of your advisory group members on a personal level. And I guess the important qualities in doing it is just having courage and honesty. So being really honest when you mess up and saying to the advisory group, like, oh my goodness, I'm sorry, I didn't think about this. Being willing to model. So if we say the safe space, that will call out things, actually doing that, being present for your advisory group and being fully there when you are engaging. It's about caring and getting to know each of the members, really believing in the group process that together we're building something. Being open and not defensive when you get critique, like when people say, actually, this isn't working, or I don't like the way this is running, we need to change. Critical self-reflexive practice, being self-aware, being willing to try different things. So advisory group may say, I want to engage in a different way, and that's okay. and just being willing to try new things. Really believing in strengths and resiliency of all of the advisory members, having some self-care in place for not only your advisory members, but also yourself, approaching things with a sense of humor and being able to laugh at yourself, and then approaching things with creativity. How can we meet people where they're at? And just being personally dedicated and committed to the idea of engaging together. questions? I'm sorry, that was a lot of information. See if there's.
Yeah, so you're welcome to, I've set the security so you can unmute yourselves if you want to ask a question or make a comment. You can do so in the chat as well. John asks, do you have any advice on conducting a post-recruitment survey? Did candidates get enough info? Was the process transparent and fair? Was the onboarding process helpful? Where to improve?
Definitely. Yeah, well, I think that that is an amazing that you're thinking about that at the beginning. I do think that it's really important to kind of build in periodic um, touching back with people and asking them these types of questions to better understand how you can improve, especially if you have a long-term advisory group and you may be recruiting again periodically. Uh, really talking to people about what the best way, and of course your survey may be online, but you also may just have phone conversations with people and collect that information on how to improve things like, yeah, if things like the recruitment material and how did we do, were we transparent? That's a really good question. Thanks, John.
Mo.
Hi, thanks for the great presentation. A lot of the content you presented reflected on like a single project or a one group research project. Any ideas or experience with having an advisory group that sits within a clinical area? We're working on this right now where we have a group of patient partners, all interested in kidney disease and their experiences with kidney disease. But the idea is this group is twofold. One is to be a connection to our researchers to match around priorities for research. But two, a goal of this group is to build capacity back to like the co-learning between researchers and patient partners and patient engagement. And so a lot of the principles you presented are similar for the things we're doing with this group, but have you had any experiences more so not project-based, but building a community, like a community practice, but basically it's a community of patient engagement, patient partners interested in two things, being linked to research, but also building capacity around patient engagement and patient-oriented research within this clinical area?
Absolutely. Like when I think about Trish too, when I think about the collaborative partnership that we have at CHI, they are a broad group of diverse people with lived experience who inform not only the organization and some of the programs and services offered, but then individually sometimes a researcher may come and have a conversation with them about how to best engage. It sounds like, yeah, to think about your group as far as building capacity. So building capacity both for like code, maybe even co-developing resources for researchers to better understand how to engage their group, but also then co-developing and finding ways to recruit, to get more people interested in becoming engaged in health research as well. The connection to researchers too, it's interesting. I think there are a number of groups within research institutes who are then where patient partners are matched with different research teams and making sure that you post different opportunities along the way. And so that in that case, I guess there is a lot of times where you'll have in between moments where you concentrate on the relationship of the advisory group members and how they want to be engaged. And then if there is a researcher who wants to connect with the group to get advice, that's an opportunity. And then building in programs and service, the co-development of programs and services as well. I would say our collaborative is much like that, where you kind of have to think through. We actually have co-chairs for our collaborative partnership. So we co-develop the agenda. And so one agenda may be a researcher is going to come and talk to them about a certain thing to get their feedback. And then another one is, hey, let's co-create a training program. How many meetings is that going to take? Who's going to want to participate? And then in the other one, like, what kind of training do you think people? And so it is a mismatch. We meet bi-monthly, so every 2 months. And so we co-develop with 2 members how we're going, what topic, and also presenting to the group, like, this is what we were hoping to talk about. Is there something that you want to address in the group? And making sure they have some choice as far as what the meeting's going to be about this time, whether it's going to be a program or training.
Excellent, thanks. Those are the thoughts we've been mulling about, and so it's great to hear those examples. Thanks for sharing.
And I think it's like what has really helped with the collaborative partnership is working really hard on talking about safe spaces and establishing that at the beginning, and having them co-develop the guiding principles and putting a lot of control in their hands about what the meetings should be like, how researchers should share information, what they're interested in providing feedback on and how they want to do that. So because there's that trust that's been built from the beginning, they're more willing to, call us out and say, hey, no, I didn't like, that's way too much information for a meeting. Don't ever do that again. Right? Like,
great point, Trish. Thanks. Yeah, that whole empowerment. I've been trying to, work on reiterating the empowerment to they're empowering them, and they're leading all this work. So great. Thanks for sharing that.
Are there other? I'm just double checking.
Amy asks, she says, hi, Carolyn. Can you elaborate on the challenges of talking to advisory groups about outcomes and how one might use appreciative inquiry to facilitate brainstorming about outcomes?
Yes. So it's interesting. We've had different research projects where things like outcomes and outcome measures sometimes are very, they're difficult for any one of us. I find it's difficult to kind of get to by just simply having a conversation. So thinking about creative ways to engage people around what matters most to them. We've done appreciative inquiry before, and that's helped us get to kind of what outcomes matter the most. We also did one time, we used something called the Ottawa Decision Aid, and it has a bunch of questions in there to kind of prompt a group to think about what outcomes should be involved in a research project and what matters most to them. And that helped as well, because you want to keep it nice and broad so that people can name outcomes that haven't been considered. And so it's fine. I feel like I'm blabbing. It's kind of finding the right participatory group or participatory approach for the group that you're engaging, to be able to think broadly about outcomes, and then also being really transparent about which ones that can be looked at in the research project and which ones are outside of the scope, but how you're going to use those ones that are outside of the scope. Perhaps you're going to mention it in an article later on, or it's not going to get lost, that their ideas still matter. But this is how we're going to use it, even if it doesn't get put into the research project. I hope I answered the question.
Yes, you got to thank you. So I think we're good on that one. And yeah, that guide that I posted the link to definitely has a lot more detail, and it has some additional resources for using the different methods as well. So you can take a deeper dive into any of those if you want to explore how you might use them. I see we're quite close to the end, so
sorry, that looks
no, that's okay. And that image, I'm going to share this one instead. Here we go.
Yes.
There we go. That's a little more clear. So before we go, I'd like to invite everyone, first of all, to complete the evaluation. We take what you say to heart and we implement as many of your suggestions and changes as we can throughout this series. And it's done us a great service to improve them over the years. So please do that. Also, please join us if you're interested on December 14th. I'm going to be talking about why patient engagement matters, specifically in data science, engineering, and technology. And I'll have one of my colleagues come in and share some specific examples of how that might be used in those type of projects. Everyone who registered will get a link to the evaluation. They'll get a link to register for the next session, to the YouTube and the slides. So as long as you registered online, you'll have all that info in your inbox shortly. So thanks everyone for joining us. And I think we'll close out the session. Look at that, right on the dot, 1 p.m.
Thanks so
Great.
much, everyone.
Thanks. Take care. Bye.